Hello again. In this module, we're going to be discussing radiation protection. So in any radiological incident, everyone wants to know how to protect themselves from radiation exposure. There are three things you need to remember in order to protect yourself at all times. There's going to be time, distance, and shielding. And on the next slide, I'm going to play a video for you that's going to go over this in more detail.
There are three protection principles that you, as a responder, can apply to minimize your exposure. They are time, distance, and shielding. Time. Minimizing your time in a field of radiation is an important factor in radiation protection. The shorter the amount of time you spend in a field of radiation, the lower the radiation dose you will receive. If you are not productively engaged in victim recovery or accident scene response, stay out of the areas with elevated radiation. If you are manning the radio or telephone, do it in a low or no radiation area. The second protection principle is distance. No matter how far the radiation can travel, your exposure will always be greatly reduced when you move away from the source of radiation. The farther away from the source of radiation you stay, the lower your dose will be. Shielding is the third protection principle. Different materials are used to shield different types of radiation. In general, the denser a material, the greater its ability to stop the passage of radiation. You can shield yourself by placing your vehicle, a mound of dirt, or available heavy equipment between you and the radiation source. Remember that clothing and turnout gear is sufficient to stop alpha and some beta radiation emitted by materials if they are present, but it does nothing to stop gamma radiation. Shielding is not always practical during emergency field operation. The identification and evaluation of victims and the administration of emergency care should not be delayed to seek shielding materials. To summarize the three protection principles, spend as little time as possible in the immediate danger area. Maintain a distance from the radioactive material, and wear protective clothing and use available shielding when possible and practical.
So just to reiterate, you need to minimize your time near any radioactive materials. Less time near the materials equals less exposure. For distance, you're going to want to maximize the distance between you and any radioactive materials. And if possible, use shielding whenever possible to reduce or eliminate your exposure. So while working in a contaminated area, one of the main questions you may have is, what is the exposure hazard to me? Before I go over this, I just want to reiterate what dose is. We discussed this in the radiation basics module, but I feel like it's necessary to go over again. So a dose is the amount of radiation absorbed by the body and is measured in the units of rem or millirem. Of course, the easiest way to avoid exposure is by keeping your distance from a contaminated area, but if your job requires it, you may find yourself working in a contaminated area. If you have to operate in one of these areas, there is an acute exposure limit on how much of a dose you can be exposed to. The limit is 12.5 rem, but if you want to volunteer to continue working in the area, you can go as high as 20 rem. You are not allowed to exceed 20 rem no matter what. So one of the main reasons there is a 20 rem limit is because there is no noticeable effects of an acute dose less than 25 rem. The limit is set lower than 25 to ensure that no one gets too high of a dose. For larger dosages, there can be several severe effects. 25 to 100 rem can lead to a slight change in your blood, causing fatigue and nausea. At 100 to 200 rem, most people will experience vomiting, fatigue, loss of appetite, and moderate changes in their blood. Recovery from this amount can take several weeks. Anyone unlucky enough to have a dose of 200 to 600 rem will experience the same vomiting, fatigue, and loss of appetite, but will also experience loss of hair within a few weeks, several blood changes to include hemorrhage and infection, there can be up to 80% of people with this exposure rate that will die within 2 months. If they don't, it can take a month to a year to recover. In order to make things a little bit easier to remember, there are 4 main numbers that you will need to remember while working. As we discussed in the dosimetry module, each of you will be wearing a self-reading dosimeter. At every 15 to 30 minutes, you will check your dosimeter for changes and make note of those changes on your green TEMA card. If your dosimeter changes and it is a reading at 1, then you will need to notify your supervisor. This will let them know that you are being exposed even though you will continue working. At this point, you will continue working, and then when your dosimeter reaches 2.5, you will stop working unless you are saving lives or valuable property. If you are doing life and property saving actions, you can continue working until your dosimeter reaches 5. If you are only saving property, you will stop once you have reached the 5 RIM limit. If you are saving lives, you are going to continue working until you reach 12.5. At 12.5, you will be done working in the contaminated area unless you volunteer to keep working. If you volunteer to keep working, you can work until you have reached 20 RIM. At this point, you will be required to stop working altogether. When you have reached your limit and are done working, you will be required to leave the contaminated area, receive a risk briefing, and zero out your dosimeter. So the dose limit table shown on the slide is also on that green TEMA card that you will have with you. So if you are working and can't remember what the dose limits are, just refer to that green card. So now we're going to discuss how to protect yourself from contamination. So one of the biggest threats when dealing with a radiological emergency is becoming internally contaminated. Loose contamination can become airborne and can be easily inhaled. This is the most common way for radioactive material to enter the body. With that being said, you can also become internally contaminated through eating, drinking, and absorption of skin through open wounds. Again, the most effective way to avoid contamination is to stay out of a contaminated area, but this may not always be possible if you are performing your work duties. If you are required to enter a contaminated area, make sure that you always wear your PPE. If you are unable to put on proper PPE, you will at the very least want to protect your airways by wearing a face mask. Preventing contamination should always be a priority, but there is always a chance of becoming contaminated. If you become externally contaminated, contamination levels can easily be reduced through proper decontamination. Once you become internally contaminated, there are 2 primary processes that are used to eliminate it. The first is a biological process that naturally occurs, in which your body will get rid of the contamination on its own. The second is through natural radioactive decay. So as time passes, the amount of radiation material will reduce. Both of these processes will depend on the type of radioactive material. Different kinds of radiation and the amount will play a factor in how long the material actually stays in your body, which we'll go over on the next slide. If you do become internally contaminated, there are several area hospitals that have been trained for these types of events. These hospitals are Erlanger, Memorial, both the Maine and Hickson locations, and Park Ridge. So as I stated in the last slide, if you become internally contaminated, the biological and radiological decay processes are going to depend on the amount and type of material. These processes can take hours to years before they rid your body of contamination. Out of alpha, beta, and gamma, alpha is the most dangerous if it gets inside your body. Alpha particles are large and can only travel short distances. Therefore, it can be stuck inside your body and take a long time to decay. Hospitals also have the ability to speed up these processes through a few different medical treatments. Prior to deploying into a contaminated area, you will receive an emergency worker kit. These kits will include a self-reading dosimeter, an OSLD, 2 doses of potassium iodide or Ki, a KI drug fact sheet, and a RAD quick reference guide. One thing to remember is that we do have a limited amount of dosimeters, so there may not be enough for each person to have their own. If this is the case, one person may be asked to wear the dosimetry for a group who will be working together. Included in your emergency kit is 2 doses of potassium iodide, or more commonly referred to as Ki. Ki is a preventative measure that can help limit the effects of internal contamination. These tablets are a salt of a stable iodine that can help block radioactive iodine from being absorbed by your thyroid. So basically, the Ki fills up your thyroid with good iodine so that none of the bad iodine can be absorbed. Also, Ki also protects your thyroid and no other parts of your body. Even though the doses are provided to you in your kit, do not take them unless you are directed to do so by your supervisor. When directed, you will be told when and how much to take. For any allergy warnings, please check the Ki drug sheet provided to you in your emergency worker kit. Basically, unless you are allergic to iodine, then you can go ahead and take the Ki. If you don't know if you're allergic to iodine, then you will very quickly find out. On the next slide, there is going to be a short video on information about Ki.
Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Pomerleau. I'm a medical toxicologist working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The video you're about to see provides information about potassium iodide. Potassium iodide, or Ki, comes in a pill or a liquid and contains stable, non-radioactive iodine that can help block radioactive iodine from being absorbed by the thyroid gland. Ki is available without a prescription, but should only be taken on the advice of public health or emergency management officials. Ki only protects your thyroid gland from absorbing radioactive iodine. It does not protect you from other sources of radiation or from external radiation exposure. It's important to note that Ki does not keep radioactive iodine from entering the body and cannot reverse its health effects once the thyroid gland is damaged. So take additional precautions to limit your exposure to radioactive iodine. If you're exposed to radioactive iodine, depending upon the severity of the exposure, public health officials could advise taking potassium iodide. Your job is to follow public health officials' specific instructions and get the recommended dosage of Ki into your system as quickly as possible. Ki's effectiveness depends on how much time has passed between the time you are exposed to radioactive iodine and the time you take Ki. Here's how it works. Ki dissolves in the stomach and releases stable iodine. The medication is carried by the bloodstream to your thyroid gland. The thyroid gland fills with stable iodine, which helps block radioactive iodine from being absorbed. After taking the medication, your thyroid won't absorb radioactive iodine for 24 hours. Public health officials will let you know if you need another dose. Pregnant women and children should be treated first because young children and unborn children are more sensitive to the effects of radioactive iodine. Some people believe that table salt or other foods rich in iodine can be used instead of Ki in an emergency. This isn't true. Remember, Ki cannot protect the rest of your body from radioactive iodine or radioactive elements other than radioactive iodine. And Ki does not protect against external sources of radiation that may be in the environment, prevent radioactive iodine from entering the body, or reverse damage radioactive iodine has already done. Ki can also cause unwanted side effects. That's why it's absolutely crucial that you always follow public health officials' specific recommendations for Ki. Only take it if advised. In case of a radiation emergency, the best way to protect yourself is to get inside, stay inside, and stay tuned for information and updates from emergency management officials. For more information on potassium iodide, please visit our website.
For the next few slides, I'm going to go over dosimetry. I'm not going to go over this in too much depth because there is a whole module dedicated to dosimetry, but some key things to remember on this slide is that there are 2 different types of dosimeters. There's the self-reading and the OSLD. Both will be provided to you in an emergency in your emergency worker kit, and both should be worn at all times while you are working in the hot zone. For this slide, remember that the self-reading dosimeter measures the accumulated dose of gamma and X-ray. It will need to be read every 15 to 30 minutes by holding it up to a light source and reading where the needle has moved to. These dosimeters are very finicky, so they can be affected through rough handling or just by being too close to some equipment such as radios. The second type of dosimeter you will receive is the optically stimulated luminescent dosimeter, or OSLD. The OSLD measures accumulated dose of gamma, beta, and X-ray. Because it requires specialized equipment to read, it does not provide on-the-spot readings. There's a small hole in the plastic underneath the little man on the TMUS sticker that allows beta radiation to pass through. Last, you will need to make sure you turn in your OSLD and self-reading dosimeter along with the green TMA form following the event. That way it can be sent to a lab to find out if you need further medical attention. As discussed in the dosimetry module, both the self-reading dosimeter and OSLD will need to be worn together in the front of the body between the neck and the waist. Make sure you are recording all information and dose readings on your green TMA form, and be sure to record your dosimeter's serial numbers on the form. While working in a contaminated area, it is important to protect your equipment. If possible, use some kind of covering such as plastic or cloth to cover and protect your equipment. Some steps you should take in order to protect your equipment and personnel include covering vehicle seating, closing vehicle windows, turning off the ventilation systems, cover or keep compartments closed and non-essential compartments closed, keep anything you don't need out of the contaminated area, work with mobile kits if possible, and cover your radio's hand mics. Before you begin working in the hot zone, you will be provided with some personal protective equipment. Many first responders will receive a PPE kit that includes Tyvek coveralls, booties, a hood, rubber overshoes, glove liners, and 2 pairs of gloves. Not included in these kits, but will also be required, are eye protection and airway protection. Also some duct or chemical resistant tape to tape off around the wrists and ankles. This information is discussed more in detail in our PPE module. In the event of a radiological emergency, there are several things that you need to remember. First, protective clothing does not generally protect against radiation dose, but it can help with contamination prevention. Anytime you enter a contaminated area, you must wear protective clothing and wear it correctly, which we will go over here momentarily. When you go into a contaminated area, do not wear any personal items that you don't want to lose, such as jewelry and cell phones. These items may become contaminated and may not be able to be decontaminated. Also, make sure you are wearing any essential equipment over your PPE so that you can easily access it. This is including radios. Lastly, if at any time your PPE becomes torn, wet, or rendered ineffective, immediately leave the contaminated area and get yourself monitored for contamination. So once you leave the contaminated area, you'll be required to go through the decontamination process. This slide will be discussed further in our decontamination module. However, it is important to remember that you may need to be deconned on the scene or be directed to one of the emergency worker decon sites to get decontaminated. These 2 sites are Red Bank High School and Ooltewah Middle School. At these sites, staff has been trained to decon personnel, equipment, and vehicles. When you arrive on scene, please make sure that you follow any instructions in order to keep yourself and those around you safe. So that is it for this module. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me at the number listed on the screen.